There's a phrase that keeps showing up in the diaries of people who watched empires die. Different languages, different centuries, different continents, but the same phrase, over and over again. Nobody believes in it anymore. A Roman senator in the 5th century, writing to a friend, complaining that the young men of good families no longer want to serve in the legions. Nobody believes in it anymore. A Spanish priest in the 17th century, watching ships full of silver arrive from the Americas, while Spanish farmers abandon their fields. Nobody believes in it anymore. A British diplomat in 1956, sitting in a bar in Cairo after the Suez Crisis, realizing that the empire he served his entire life is finished. Nobody believes in it anymore. A Soviet general in August 1991, watching tanks roll into Moscow to save a system that even the men driving the tanks know is dead. Nobody believes in it anymore. 4 empires, 4 centuries, 4 versions of the same sentence. And here's what's terrifying. None of these empires were destroyed by an enemy. Not really. Yes, there were barbarians at Rome's gates. Yes, there were rivals to Spain and Britain and the Soviet Union. But the fatal wound was never external. The fatal wound was always the same. The people inside the empire, the people who ran it, who profited from it, who were supposed to defend it, stopped believing that the empire was worth defending. Every empire dies the same way, not with a bang, not with an invasion, but with a shrug. Today we're going to visit 5 funerals, 5 moments where someone, a specific person, in a specific place, looked at the empire they lived in and realized, this is already dead. We just haven't buried it yet. And the 5th funeral is happening right now. Let's start with Rome, because everyone thinks they know why Rome fell, and almost everyone is wrong. The story you learned in school goes something like this. Barbarian tribes invaded, the legions couldn't hold them back, and the greatest civilization in history was overrun by savages. It's a dramatic story. Warriors at the gates, the last stand of civilization. It's also nonsense. Rome wasn't murdered. Rome committed suicide. Slowly over centuries in ways that the Romans themselves could see happening but couldn't stop. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was, on paper, still the most powerful state in the world. It had the largest army, the most advanced infrastructure, the most sophisticated legal system. If you'd looked at a map in the year 400, you'd have seen an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. But maps lie, because inside that vast territory, something was rotting. The Roman elite had stopped investing in Rome. The great senatorial families, the people with the money and the power, were pulling out of public life. They were buying enormous rural estates, building private armies, and essentially creating their own mini-kingdoms within the empire. Why would they do that? Because the empire wasn't working for them anymore. Taxes were crushing, the bureaucracy was bloated and corrupt. The army was expensive and unreliable. It was cheaper and safer to protect yourself than to rely on the state. And if the rich were checking out, the poor had checked out long ago. Roman citizenship, which had once been the most valuable thing in the ancient world, the thing people fought and died and begged for, meant nothing by the 5th century. Citizens had no more rights than non-citizens. The law protected the powerful and crushed everyone else. The Roman army tells the story perfectly. At its peak, the legions were made up of Roman citizens who fought for their country, men who believed they were part of something greater than themselves. By the 5th century, the legions were filled with Germanic mercenaries who fought for money. They were good soldiers, but they weren't Romans. They had no attachment to Rome, no belief in what Rome meant. And this is where we find our first moment of death. Stilicho, Flavius Stilicho, half Roman, half Vandal. The last great general of the Western Empire. For 2 decades, he held Rome together through sheer force of will. He defeated the Visigoths. He stopped invasions. He was the one man standing between the empire and collapse. And in 408, the Roman court had him arrested and executed. Why? Politics. Jealousy. A Christian faction at court that distrusted him because of his barbarian blood. The usual pathetic reasons that empires eat their own defenders. When word of Stilicho's execution spread, his barbarian soldiers, thousands of them, men who had fought loyally for Rome, deserted. Many of them joined the Visigoths, The same Visigoths who would sack Rome 2 years later, in 410. Rome didn't fall because the Visigoths were strong. Rome fell because it killed the one man who could have stopped them, and the people who killed him did it for personal gain, knowing full well what would happen. That's the moment. That's the funeral. Not when the Visigoths entered Rome, when Rome chose to destroy its own defender rather than trust someone who didn't look like them. The last Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 by a barbarian general named Odoacer. You know what Odoacer did with the imperial regalia? He sent it to Constantinople. He didn't even want it. The crown of the most powerful empire in history wasn't taken by force. It was discarded, like a hat nobody wanted to wear. And across the former empire, most people barely noticed. Life had already moved on. The empire had been dead for decades. The funeral in 476 was just a formality. But if Rome was a suicide, Spain was something different. Spain was a poisoning. And the poison was the most seductive substance in the world: money. In the 16th century, Spain was the most powerful country on earth. The Spanish Empire stretched from the Philippines to Peru. Spanish armies dominated Europe. The Spanish Navy controlled the Atlantic. Spanish conquistadors had conquered entire civilizations. And then Spain found silver. Mountains of it. Literally. The Potosi mine in modern-day Bolivia was the largest silver deposit ever discovered. At its peak, it produced so much silver that it reshaped the entire global economy. Ships loaded with silver crossed the Atlantic in convoys, pouring wealth into Spain at a rate that had never been seen before. You'd think this would make Spain invincible. Unlimited money, the strongest military, a global empire. What could go wrong? Everything. Because the silver didn't build Spain. It hollowed Spain out. Here's what happened. When you flood a country with money, prices go up. Spain experienced massive inflation throughout the 16th century, the so-called price revolution. Everything got more expensive, but Spanish wages didn't keep up because why would they? There was so much easy money flowing in from the Americas that nobody needed to actually produce anything. Spanish manufacturing collapsed. Why build a textile industry when you can just buy cloth from the Netherlands? Why invest in farming when you can import food? Why develop technology when you can pay someone else to develop it for you? Spain became a country that consumed without producing, a country that bought everything and made nothing. The silver flowed in from Peru and Mexico, and it flowed right back out to Italian bankers, Flemish merchants, and German arms dealers. Spain was a pipe, not a basin. The wealth passed through it, but didn't stay. And the Spanish elite? They loved it. The nobility didn't invest in industry or agriculture. They bought titles, built palaces, and waged wars. The hidalgos, the lower nobility, considered manual labor beneath their dignity. Better to starve proudly than to work like a commoner. Meanwhile, the actual productive people, Jews, Muslims, conversos, had been expelled or persecuted by the Inquisition. Spain drove out the people who knew how to run businesses and replaced them with aristocrats who knew how to spend money. If you're finding these patterns fascinating, hit that subscribe button, because the next empire we're going to examine is going to hit even closer to home. Now here's our moment, our funeral for Spain. Philip II, the most powerful monarch in the world. Ruler of Spain, Portugal, Naples, the Netherlands, half of the Americas, and the Philippines. A man who commanded more territory than any European since Charlemagne. And he declared bankruptcy, not once, 4 times, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. The king of the richest empire on earth couldn't pay his bills. Ships full of silver were arriving every month, and it still wasn't enough, because the spending was always greater than the income. The wars never ended, and the debts kept compounding. Philip knew. He wrote letters about it. He understood that the empire was spending itself to death, but he couldn't stop. The wars in the Netherlands had to be funded. The Catholic faith had to be defended. The empire had to be maintained. Stopping any of it would mean admitting that Spain was no longer what it claimed to be. So he kept borrowing, and kept going bankrupt, and kept pretending. After Philip died in 1598, Spain entered a long, slow decline that lasted over a century. By the time it was obvious to everyone, it had been obvious to the people inside for generations. The silver kept flowing, the empire kept shrinking, and nobody at the top had the courage to admit that the game was over. Spain's funeral wasn't a battle or a revolution, it was a balance sheet. The most powerful man in the world sitting in his palace, looking at numbers that didn't add up, and choosing to keep spending anyway because stopping would mean admitting the truth. Now let's talk about Britain, because Britain's funeral is different from the others. It's quieter, almost dignified. Rome killed itself through selfishness. Spain poisoned itself with money. But Britain simply got tired. In 1945, the British Empire was, on paper, the largest empire in human history. A quarter of the world's land, a quarter of the world's population, colonies on every continent, a navy that had ruled the oceans for 2 centuries. And within 20 years, almost all of it was gone. The standard explanation is that Britain was weakened by 2 world wars and couldn't afford an empire anymore. That's true, but it's not the whole story. Plenty of empires have survived financial crises. Plenty of empires have rebuilt after devastating wars. What made Britain different is that the British people, and more importantly, the British elite, stopped wanting an empire. This didn't happen overnight. It was a slow shift that began in the trenches of the First World War and completed itself in the ruins of the Second. Before 1914, the British Empire was sustained by a belief, sincere, deeply held, almost religious, that the British had a duty to civilize the world. The white man's burden, as Kipling put it. The idea that British rule was not exploitation, but a gift. That the Indian, the African, the Malay were better off under British governance than on their own. You can argue about whether anyone actually believed this or whether it was just a convenient fiction. But the point is that it worked. It motivated young men to go to distant corners of the world and spend their lives administering colonies. It motivated taxpayers to fund a global military presence. It gave the empire a story, and empires need stories to survive. The First World War shattered that story. 700,000 British dead. An entire generation of young men who went to France believing in duty and honor, and came back, those who came back, believing in nothing. The poets tell the story better than the historians. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, men who went to war as patriots and came back as ghosts. Owen's most famous poem ends with a Latin phrase that every British schoolboy had been taught to revere. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Owen called it the old lie. When the men who believed in the old lie were replaced by men who'd seen what that lie cost, that was the beginning of the end. Not of Britain as a country, but of Britain as an empire. The Second World War finished the job. Britain won the war technically, but winning cost everything. The treasury was empty, the infrastructure was shattered, and the moral argument for empire had been destroyed by the war itself. You cannot fight a 6-year war against a regime that conquers other nations and enslaves their people, and then go home and continue conquering other nations and extracting their wealth. The contradiction was too obvious. British soldiers had fought against imperialism in Europe while serving an imperial power themselves. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable, and the new generation of British leaders, Clement Attlee, the Labour government elected in 1945, didn't even try to maintain it. They were focused on building a welfare state at home, the National Health Service, public housing, nationalized industries. The empire was a distraction and a cost. Better to let it go. India went first in 1947, then Burma, Ceylon, Palestine. Through the 1950s and 1960s, colony after colony gained independence. The sun that was never supposed to set on the British Empire was going down fast. But the real funeral, the moment when everyone knew, was Suez. October 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been controlled by British and French interests. Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to seize the canal back. Militarily, it worked. The Anglo-French force took the canal zone quickly, but then the United States intervened. Not militarily, financially. President Eisenhower threatened to collapse the British pound. He told the British, "Withdraw from Suez or we will destroy your currency." Britain withdrew. In humiliation. in full view of the entire world. And in that moment, every British diplomat, every British general, every British politician understood the truth. Britain was no longer a great power. It couldn't act without American permission. The empire was over, not because of rebellions in the colonies, but because the new superpower had put Britain in its place. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister who launched the Suez operation, had a nervous breakdown. He resigned within months. He spent the rest of his life defending the decision. But everyone knew Suez was the end, the last imperial act slapped down by reality. A British diplomat, and this is the story I opened with, was sitting in a bar in Cairo after the withdrawal. He'd spent his career in the Foreign Office, administering pieces of an empire that no longer existed. And he said to the man next to him, "Nobody believes in it anymore. Not even us." That's the funeral. Not a conquest, not a revolution, a quiet admission in a bar by a man who'd given his life to something that had already died. Now, the Soviet Union. If Britain's funeral was quiet, the Soviet Union's was absurd. It was a funeral where the pallbearers dropped the coffin, argued about who should pick it up, and then pretended the body inside was still alive for 3 more days. The Soviet Union was built on an idea, not a nation, not a culture, an idea. The idea that communism would create a just society, that the working class would triumph over capitalism, that history was moving in one direction, and the Soviet Union was leading the way. For decades, millions of people believed this, not just in Russia, around the world, intellectuals in Paris, revolutionaries in Havana, liberation movements in Africa. The Soviet model was the alternative to Western capitalism, and for a significant portion of the global population, it was the more attractive alternative. But by the 1970s, something strange had happened inside the Soviet Union. The people who ran the system, the Communist Party elite, the nomenklatura, had stopped believing in communism. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, they still gave the speeches, still attended the congresses, still mouthed the Marxist-Leninist formulas, but privately among themselves, the faith was gone. Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, the most powerful man in the communist world, collected luxury Western cars. He had a Rolls-Royce, a Cadillac, a Lincoln Continental. The leader of the global revolution against capitalist excess had a garage full of capitalist excess. This wasn't hypocrisy in the usual sense. Brezhnev wasn't hiding a secret love of capitalism. He simply didn't think about the contradiction, because the ideology had become meaningless to him. It was just words. Everyone said the words. Nobody thought about what they meant. There's a Soviet joke from this era that captures it perfectly. A man is standing in line to buy bread. The line is hours long. Finally, he snaps. "I'm going to the Kremlin to kill Brezhnev," he says, and storms off. An hour later, he comes back. "What happened?" the others ask. "The line there was even longer," he replies. Everyone knew. That's the key. Everyone in the Soviet Union knew the system was broken. The workers knew. The managers knew. The party officials knew. The KGB knew. But nobody could say it, and nobody could change it, because the entire structure depended on pretending. If you're watching this and thinking, "This sounds familiar," you're not wrong. And that's exactly what we're going to get to. But first, I need to tell you about 3 days in August that perfectly captured the death of an empire that had already been dead for years. August 19th, 1991. A group of hardline Communist Party officials launched a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. They were terrified that Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, perestroika, were destroying the Soviet Union, which, to be fair, they were. But the hardliners believed they could save the system by force. They sent tanks into Moscow. They declared a state of emergency. They put Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea. And then, nothing. The coup simply didn't work. Not because it was defeated by some heroic resistance, although Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank made for great television. It didn't work because the people running the coup didn't believe in it. The leader of the coup, Gennady Yanayev, held a press conference on the first day. His hands were visibly shaking. He looked like a man who had been told he was in charge of saving the Soviet Union and realized in real time that it couldn't be saved. The military commanders who were supposed to enforce the coup kept finding reasons not to. Troops were ordered to secure key buildings. They parked their tanks and did nothing. Soldiers were ordered to arrest dissidents. They stayed in their vehicles. The entire military apparatus of the Soviet Union was given an order to save the system, and it collectively shrugged. 3 days later, the coup collapsed. Within 4 months, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. On December 25, 1991, the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. But here's what I want you to understand. The Soviet Union didn't die in December 1991. It didn't even die in August 1991. It died years earlier, maybe decades earlier, when the people who ran it stopped believing in it. The coup was the moment of truth, not because it failed, but because of how it failed. The most powerful security apparatus in the world, with the largest nuclear arsenal in human history, with millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks, couldn't save a system that its own leaders no longer believed in. Yanayev's shaking hands. That's the funeral. A man who staged a coup to save an empire, and whose own body betrayed him, trembling with the knowledge that there was nothing left to save. After the Soviet flag came down, a Russian journalist interviewed a Kremlin official who had served the Communist Party for 30 years. "Did you believe in communism?" the journalist asked. The official paused for a long time. "I believed in it the way you believe in a wall," he said. "You lean on it every day. You plan your life around it. And then one morning you lean on it and it's not there. You fall. Not because the wall was knocked down, because it was never solid to begin with." That's 4 funerals, 4 empires, 4 moments when the people inside looked at the structure they were supposed to defend and realized it was already hollow. And now you're waiting for the 5th. I know you are, because the pattern is too obvious, too clean, too familiar. You've been watching this video and a voice in the back of your head has been whispering a name, a country, a present-day superpower that checks every single box we've just walked through. We'll get there. But first, I need to show you what connects these 4 deaths, because on the surface they look different. Rome was ancient, Spain was early modern, Britain was colonial, the Soviet Union was ideological, different eras, different systems, different cultures. But underneath, the mechanism is identical. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every empire runs on a story, a narrative that explains why this particular group of people deserves to rule, why the system is just, why the sacrifices are worth making. Rome's story was civilization. We bring law, roads, aqueducts, order. Without us, the world is barbarism. Spain's story was faith. We bring the true religion to the heathens. God chose us to lead. Britain's story was progress. We bring modernity, railways, institutions, governance. The world is better because we administer it. The Soviet Union's story was equality. We bring justice to the working class. History itself is on our side. 4 different stories, but each one served the same function. It gave people a reason to serve, to sacrifice, to believe that their empire was different from all the empires that came before. Special, exempt from the cycle. And here's the pattern. In every case, every single case, the empire died when its own elite stopped believing the story. Not when the story became false. It was always at least partially false. Romans were brutal conquerors who enslaved millions. Spain's faith was a cover for genocide and plunder. Britain's progress came at the cost of colonial exploitation. Soviet equality was a fiction masking totalitarian control. The stories were always flawed, but they worked. As long as enough people believed them, or at least acted as if they did. The moment of death is not when the story becomes untrue. It's when the people telling the story stop pretending it's true. When Roman senators stopped sending their sons to the legions and started building private fortresses. When Spanish nobility stopped investing in the country and started hoarding titles. When British diplomats stopped believing in the civilizing mission and started counting the cost. When Soviet officials stopped believing in communism and started collecting Western luxuries. Each of these moments looks different on the surface, but structurally, they're the same event. The ruling class defects from its own system, not violently, quietly. They stop maintaining the thing that gives them power. They extract what they can and retreat into private comfort. And once that happens, collapse is just a matter of time. The body still moves, The army still marches. The bureaucracy still functions. But the spirit, the thing that made people willingly participate, is gone. An empire without believers is a machine running on fumes. It can coast for decades, sometimes centuries, but it cannot recover. Because the only people who could fix it, the people with power, are the same people who've stopped caring. This is why empires never reform their way out of decline. Not because reform is impossible, but because the people who would need to implement reform are the people who benefit from the decline. The Roman senators who could have strengthened the legions were the same ones profiting from private armies. The Spanish nobles who could have invested in industry were the same ones living off colonial silver. The British politicians who could have reimagined the empire were the same ones cutting costs. The Soviet officials who could have reformed the system were the same ones who'd built comfortable lives within its dysfunction. Every empire creates a class of people whose personal interests diverge from the empire's survival, and that class always wins, not through conspiracy, through the simple human logic of self-interest. And now, the fifth funeral. I'm not going to tell you which country I'm talking about. You already know. You've known since the first minute of this video. But I want you to reach the conclusion yourself, because a conclusion you reach on your own is worth more than one I hand you. So let me just describe what I see. Without names, without judgment, just the pattern. I see a country that was built on a story, a powerful story, maybe the most powerful story any country has ever told. A story about freedom, opportunity, self-governance. A story that inspired millions of people around the world to immigrate, to invest, to believe. And I see that story fraying. Not because it was never true, it was true enough, for enough people, for long enough to build something extraordinary. But true enough is not the same as true. And the gap between the story and the reality has been widening for decades. I see an elite that has disconnected from the country it leads. An elite that lives in a different economy, sends its children to different schools, breathes different air. An elite that has more in common with elites in other countries than with the citizens of its own. I see a military stretched across the world, bases in dozens of countries, wars that last decades, budgets that would be the entire GDP of most nations, and a growing feeling among both the people who fund it and the people who fight in it that it's not clear what any of it is for anymore. I see a political system that has become a spectacle, where the mechanisms of governance, debate, compromise, legislation have been replaced by performance, where the question is no longer what is the best policy, but which side are you on, where the institutions designed to hold the system together are being hollowed out by the people who run them. I see debt, enormous, almost incomprehensible debt, the kind of debt that would bankrupt any other country. Debt that works only because the rest of the world is locked into a financial system that forces them to fund it. A system that depends entirely on trust, and trust, as we've seen 4 times now, is the first thing to go. I see infrastructure crumbling, bridges, roads, water systems, power grids, built by a previous generation that believed in public investment, now slowly decaying because the current generation can't agree on how to fix them or who should pay. I see a country where the citizens are increasingly sorted into 2 groups that don't speak to each other, don't trust each other, and don't share a common story about what the country is or what it should be. 2 groups that each believe the other is destroying the nation. 2 groups that have given up on convincing each other and are now simply trying to defeat each other. And most of all, most importantly, I see a growing number of people, on both sides of that divide, who have stopped believing in the system itself. Not in their side of the argument, in the argument, in the idea that the system can produce good outcomes, in the idea that their participation matters, in the idea that the country they live in is fundamentally sound. They haven't left. They haven't revolted. They've done something quieter and more devastating. They've shrugged. Does this mean the 5th funeral is already happening? I don't know. History doesn't repeat itself exactly. Every empire is different. Every collapse has its own timeline, its own surprises, its own turning points. Maybe the pattern breaks this time. Maybe this country finds a way to renew its story, to rebuild trust, to reconnect its elite with its citizens. It's happened before, not often, but it's happened. Rome had Augustus. Britain had its post-imperial reinvention. Decline is not destiny, but the pattern is there, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Every empire in history has believed it was the exception. Rome believed it was eternal. The word Rome literally meant the world. Spain believed God had chosen it. Britain believed its institutions were too strong to fail. The Soviet Union believed history itself guaranteed its survival. They were all wrong, not because they were stupid or weak or corrupt, although they were all of those things. They were wrong because they confused the story with reality. They believed that because the story had been true once, it would be true forever. And by the time they realized the story had died, the empire was already following it into the ground. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Not about empires, about you. What's the story your country tells about itself? And do you still believe it? Not the version on the posters and in the speeches, the version in your gut. When you look at your government, your institutions, your leaders, do you feel like you're part of something that works? Something that's going somewhere? Something worth defending? Or do you feel that quiet thing, that thing the Roman senator felt, that the Spanish priest felt, that the British diplomat felt, that the Soviet official felt, that creeping sense that the machine is still running but nobody's driving it anymore? Because that feeling, that exact feeling, is how empires die. Not with a bang, not with an invasion, but with millions of people, one by one, quietly, privately, reaching the same conclusion. Nobody believes in it anymore. If this video made you think, really think, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, which of these 5 funerals hit you the hardest? And which empire do you think we're living through the death of right now? Subscribe if you want more videos like this, because understanding how the world really works, not the version in the textbooks, the real version, that's what this channel is about. I'll see you in the next one.